Okay, guys, let's talk about the evaluation of a function and also graphing the domain. Okay, so the basic idea here is that if you want to evaluate a function of two variables, you just need to plug in the values of x and y. And if the value is undefined, you're going to just type d and e. Now remember that square root is only defined of positive numbers or 0. So if you get a negative number, that's going to be undefined. And theoretically, you are not really supposed to use a calculator. It shouldn't be needed. So if I were to plug in 0, 0, I would get 3 times 0 minus 0 plus 6. So that's just square root of 6. That is okay. And that's just going to be some number, but you can't put a decimal. So you're just going to put square root of 6. Okay, now I want to know what about f of 3, 6. So I'm plugging in 3 for x and 6 for y. All right, so this is where I get square root of 9, and that's just 3, so that's definitely defined. What I would say is that the point 0, 0 is in the domain of this function, and also the point 3, 6 is in the domain because I was able to plug in and get in value that is defined. Okay, so let's try 0, 8. So we plug in 0 for x and 8 for y. Okay, so at this point we get a square root of a negative number, which is actually a complex number, but we are dealing in decimals and we're dealing in real numbers here. So that is just going to be D and E. So that's undefined. We're just going to say D and E. Okay, now the next one is f of 0, 6. So we are plugging in x equals 0 and y equals 6. So in this case, we actually get square root of 0, and square root of 0 is 0. That's actually one of the mistakes that I see sometimes people make, is that they think that square root of 0 is undefined. So I'm not sure why, but if you ask me, like, is there a number such as if I square it, I get 0? Of course there is, such as 0. So f of 0 is, or square root of 0 is 0. So I can say that 0, 8 is not in the domain, but these other values are in the domain. All right, so how am I going to graph it? So to graph the domain, you need to do two steps. Step number one, you need to graph the boundary. So how do I do that? So what you do is you're going to write down your function, and you are going to make the inside of it equal to 0. So you're going to get rid of the square root, and you're going to say, okay, let me make this equal to 0 and graph this expression. Now, this is actually a line. And you can see that because x is not squared, y is not squared. And that means it's going to be a line. So if I were to add y to both sides, I'm going to wind up with 3x plus 6 equal to y. So your step number one is to graph the boundary. So this is the boundary of the domain, because the domain will be separated with values at 0. Okay, so how do I graph something like this? Well, this is a line, obviously. So to graph the line, I need 2 points. So for example, if I plug in x equals 0, I will get 6. So 0, 6 would be one possible point. Or, let's maybe plug in 1. And so if I plug in 1, then that I will get 9. So for a line, you only need 2 points. Now, what you need to decide here, and we already decided it's going to be a line, so it's not going to be a parabola, so it's not going to be any of these. It's going to be one of these. But there are two possibilities. One with a solid line, solid boundary, and one with a dashed. Well, how do you know that? The idea here is that whether the boundary itself belongs to the domain. So the boundary, for example, consists of a point 0.06, which you can recognize right here. You can see that 0.6 was one of the points. And we got a value out of it, right? We did not get undefined. So boundary here is included. So I want you to remember that anytime you're dealing with the square root function and you're trying to find the domain, the boundary will always be a solid curve, whether it's a line, a parabola, whatever, but it has to be solid, because the boundary itself on the boundary, you will get square root of 0, which is going to be 0, and that's going to be defined. So out of these two choices, if I see a square root, I'm going to pick the one that is solid boundary, okay, not dashed. And so let me graph it. So I'm going to pick this one, which is picked by default. And let's take 0, 6. So that's 1 point. And then let's take 1, 9. That's another point. Okay, so I graphed the boundary. The next thing I need to do is to decide whether I am going to shade. So my domain is going to include everything to the left of the boundary or everything to the right of the boundary. Now that actually is very simple because you can see over here that any of these points where you get anything other than D and E should belong to the domain. So for example, 0, 0 must be in the domain and 0, 0 is right here. So then you already know the domain is going to be to the right of that line. So 3, 6, where is 3, 6? Well, 3, 6 is also over here somewhere. I don't need to graph it, but I can just tell that 3, 6 is there. Also 0, 6, well, that's on the boundary. But for example, 0, 8, which would be like over here somewhere, that should not be in the domain. So I already know that I got it. I got it correct.